Hi, this is Gary. You're watching a three-part series on how to play Monopoly. This is part one of three. It's called Strategies and Tips. Part two of three involves dice probability charts, and part three is basic trading concepts and strategies. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, in this video we're going to cover Monopoly, basic strategies and tips. First off, we're going to start out with income tax. Now, when you land on the income tax spot, you have an option to either pay 200 or 10%. Seems like a simple question, but let's cover which option is better for when. First, we'll start with the 10%. Now, keep in mind that we start out with 1,500 usually. 10% of 1,500 is 150, which is less than 200. So that makes that scenario a better option to use the 10%. Basically, the first few turns, it's better to pay the 10%. Now, another situation where it might be good to pay the 10% is if your financial position in the game is deteriorated to the point where you don't really have any assets or anything like that. Otherwise, the $200 is going to be the best option, unless we're in one of the situations that I've just outlined to the right of the chart. Okay, in this segment we're going to cover jail and what our basic strategy should be. Now, in real life, nobody wants to go to jail, and it's not a good strategy to be in jail. But Monopoly is a little different. Let's take a look here. First off, early in the game, it's best to pay the $50. Why, you ask? Well, you want to try to focus on acquiring properties, and by acquiring properties, you can generate cash flow throughout the game, other than the just passing go and collecting $200. Now, later in the game, going to jail can actually be advantageous if the conditions are right. And those conditions would be properties are completely developed, where your opponent has hotels and stuff. And the advantage of being in jail is you can avoid paying rents for 2 to 3 turns, and you can still collect income from the properties you hold, but you don't have to pay any rent. So those are the two scenarios there for jail. Okay, moving on to optimal houses. My answer to the question is always going to be 3, unless you have plenty of cash to purchase more houses or a hotel. And let's take a look at this. Well, if cash is tight, it's better to have 3 houses on St. Charles Place than 2 houses on New York Avenue, plus 2 houses on St. Charles Place. Now, it might seem counterintuitive, but let's take a look at why. And the reason why is going to be cash flow. If you have 2 houses on New York Avenue, you're getting $734 for 2 players per turn on average, and for 2 houses on St. Charles Place, you're getting $478 per turn on average. Now, that comes out to $12.12. Whereas if you have 3 houses on St. Charles Place, you're actually getting $14.34 in cash flow. So you're getting about 15 to 20% more in cash flow. And obviously, the more players you have in the game, the more this gap gets expounded or expands. And the data for cash flow I got out of my book that I wrote on Lulu. It's called Monopoly Property Valuation Strategy by me, Gary DeVries, and that data comes from page 58. Okay, the next concept we're going to cover is more players translates into more cash flow. The concept sounds simple, but let's take a look at it here. First off, if you got more players, you have a better chance of collecting rent. Early in the game, you could have railroads plus utilities. They're going to decrease in value as we go on later in the game, but early in the game they're going to have a higher value. The reason they decrease in value is that on a relative basis, other properties can be developed, which makes them more valuable in terms of cash flow as the game moves on. But for early game strategy, owning the rails plus utilities or some combination of that can be good because you're going to generate a lot of cash flow, and you might actually have the highest cash flow on a relative basis, depending on what properties your opponents hold. Okay, moving on to auctions, we're going to look at two scenarios. The first scenario is with 6 players. The second scenario is with 2 players. Let's go ahead and start with the first scenario. As you know, we start out with 1,500 each. So with 6 players, 1,500 times 6 is 9,000. It'll be $9,000 in the market to start out with. There's 28 properties on the board. Doing the math here, that comes out to $321.43 per property. So that's how much on average can be spent on each property. That can be skewed up or skewed down, obviously. Now with 2 players in the game, there's a little bit different scenario, and that is there's only $3,000 in the market chasing 28 properties. Doing the math here, that comes out to $107.14 per property, and basically what this means is if you're playing heads up against another player, it might actually be advantageous to put up properties for auctions. If they're going to make a mistake in overpaying, then they won't be able to bid for properties later. Essentially what I'm saying here is if you're playing with 6 players, you never want to put up a property for auction because it's going to cost you more to purchase it in the auction than it would outright. But if you're playing 2 players, there can be situations where you can get your opponent to overpay, or you know, if your opponent is short cash, you can put the property up for auction and there's no way they can outbid you. Another important strategy or tip in Monopoly is that you want to know what your opponent's preferences are, and that is important in trading. I'm going to give you an example here. Let's say you want to make a trade with player A. Well, they might want some properties that you don't have. So in order to make an trade that would entice player A, you might have to make a trade with player B and then player C or some combination of that to get the properties player A wants, so you can make the original trade you wanted with player A. So you kind of have to feel out how other people are trading and position yourself in that regard. Moving on to mortgaging tips. First off, you cannot collect rent on a mortgage property. That's pretty straightforward. If you're gonna mortgage, the best way to start out is single properties of a color group. That should be your first choice. Another option is doing some mortgaging and trading those properties to somebody who's interested in that. You don't want to trade a property that completes a color group for somebody else, but it might be advantageous to trade 2 or 3 mortgage properties to an opponent to improve your cash flow situation. But keep in mind that you cannot collect rents on mortgage property, and the first ones you typically want to mortgage, if you do, are single properties of a color group, so you limit the damage to cash flow that it can do for you in the game. Okay, the last part of this segment right here, we're going to cover blocking. Now, to start off, you get 32 houses and 12 hotels. To build a hotel, you've got to have 4 houses. So theoretically, if you own all the houses, your opponent can't build a hotel. Or if you own enough of the houses to cause a shortage. Just to give you an idea here, you can keep 12 houses on 3 properties and 24 on 6 properties, and that's of the 32 that are available. And if you hold all the houses, your opponent can't build a hotel, and this could be good if your opponent has more expensive properties, but if they can't build on them, they cannot realize their cash flow. And that concludes the end of the first of a 3-part series.